Alexander Morrison's blood turned to ice as he stared down at the freshly dug grave behind the abandoned barn. The soft earth still dark with recent digging and decorated with wildflowers that couldn't have been picked more than hours ago. When Evelyn Walsh knelt beside the makeshift burial site and whispered, "That's my husband," with the kind of calm that only came from complete madness, Alexander realized he wasn't dealing with a lonely widow looking for companionship. He was trapped on an isolated mountain farm with a woman who collected men like trophies and buried them when she grew tired of playing house. The other personal belongings scattered around the grave told a story that made his knees give out. Different wallets, different watches, different clothes from different eras. Alexander wasn't Evelyn's first tenant, and judging by the possessive gleam in her eyes as she stared at him over her husband's grave, he wouldn't be her last unless he found a way to escape before becoming the next permanent resident of her private cemetery. 3 weeks earlier, Alexander had thought he'd found paradise when he'd answered Evelyn's advertisement for a farmhand position with lodging included. He'd been drifting through Colorado territory for months, working cattle ranches and mining claims while trying to forget the woman back in Denver who'd broken his heart and stolen his savings. The idea of spending a quiet winter in the Rocky Mountains, helping a widow maintain her late husband's property, had seemed like exactly the kind of peaceful isolation he needed to rebuild his life and his finances. The Walsh farm sat in a hidden valley 30 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding mountain trail that became impassable during heavy snows. The isolation that had initially attracted Alexander now felt ominous as he remembered how completely cut off they were from civilization during the long winter months ahead. Evelyn had mentioned during their initial correspondence that her husband Robert had died 2 years earlier in a hunting accident, leaving her alone to manage a property that was too much for one person to handle. She'd seemed grateful for his help and eager for the company, though Alexander had noticed even then that she spoke about her deceased husband in oddly present terms. Evelyn Walsh was 32 years old and breathtakingly beautiful in the ethereal way of women who'd lived through profound loss. Her dark hair was always perfectly arranged despite the isolation. Her clothes were finer than most frontier women could afford, and her pale blue eyes held depths that seemed to reflect more secrets than sorrows. She moved through the farmhouse like a ghost, appearing silently in doorways and speaking in whispers that made Alexander strain to hear her words. Everything about her suggested fragility and vulnerability, which had made Alexander feel protective rather than wary during their first meetings. The romance had developed with startling intensity once Alexander moved into the small cabin behind the main house. Evelyn brought him meals that were far more elaborate than necessary, lingered to talk during his work breaks, and found excuses to touch his arm or shoulder while explaining farm tasks. Her attention was intoxicating after months of loneliness, and Alexander found himself looking forward to their conversations with an eagerness that surprised him. Evelyn seemed genuinely interested in his stories about life on the frontier, his dreams for the future, and his reasons for seeking solitude in the mountains. Within a week, their relationship had progressed beyond employer and employee into something far more intimate and consuming. Evelyn was passionate in ways that took Alexander's breath away, desperate for affection and connection in ways that made him feel needed and important. She cooked his favorite meals, mended his clothes with meticulous care, and made him feel like the most important person in her carefully ordered world. The intensity of her devotion was overwhelming but addictive, especially for a man who'd recently been abandoned by someone he'd trusted completely. But there were disturbing elements to Evelyn's behavior that Alexander had initially dismissed as eccentric grief rather than signs of deeper instability. She talked about Robert constantly, describing his preferences and opinions as if he were still alive to express them. She set places for him at dinner, maintained his clothes in perfect condition, and sometimes argued with empty rooms as if carrying on conversations with invisible presences. When Alexander gently suggested that she might benefit from letting go of her husband's memory, Evelyn's reaction had been swift and chilling. "Robert doesn't like it when people suggest he's really gone," she'd said with icy calm that made Alexander's skin crawl. "He gets very upset when I consider replacing him permanently, but he understands that I need companionship during the long winter months." The way she'd looked at Alexander while saying those words had made him feel like prey being sized up by a predator, though he'd convinced himself he was overreacting to a grieving woman's unusual coping mechanisms. The farm itself had felt wrong from the beginning, though Alexander hadn't been able to identify exactly what bothered him about the property. Everything was too perfect, too carefully maintained for a place that had supposedly been managed by a grieving widow for 2 years. The house was immaculate, the outbuildings were in excellent repair, and even the abandoned barn that Evelyn claimed hadn't been used since Robert's death showed signs of recent activity. There were tool marks in the dirt floor, fresh wood shavings scattered around, and in smell that Alexander couldn't quite identify, but that made his stomach turn whenever he ventured inside. The other disturbing element was Evelyn's possessiveness, which had grown more intense with each passing day of their relationship. She questioned him constantly about his past relationships, his future plans, and his level of commitment to staying on the farm permanently. When Alexander mentioned that he'd eventually need to move on to find more permanent work, Evelyn's reaction had been immediate and frightening. Her pale composure had cracked to reveal something savage underneath, a desperation that made her physically grab his arms and beg him never to leave her alone again. "I can't be alone," she'd whispered with tears streaming down her face, her fingers digging into his flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "Robert promised he'd never leave me, and then he did. But he came back, Alexander. He always comes back when I need him. And now I need you to promise the same thing." The intensity of her plea had been both touching and terrifying, revealing depths of need that no single person could ever hope to fill. Alexander had tried to reassure her without making commitments he couldn't keep, but Evelyn's moods had become increasingly unstable as autumn progressed into early winter. She alternated between passionate devotion and cold suspicion, sometimes within the same conversation. She would accuse him of planning to abandon her, then apologize with desperate physical affection that left him feeling manipulated and confused. The isolation of the farm made it impossible to gain perspective on their relationship or seek advice from others who might help him understand whether Evelyn's behavior was normal grief or something far more dangerous. Now, staring down at the fresh grave that definitely hadn't been there when he'd explored the property 3 weeks ago, Alexander understood that every instinct that had warned him something was wrong had been absolutely correct. The soft earth, the fresh flowers, the personal belongings that clearly didn't all belong to the same person told a story that made his blood run cold. Evelyn Walsh wasn't a lonely widow seeking companionship. She was a predator who lured men to her isolated farm and disposed of them when they no longer served her purposes. Alexander forced himself to remain calm as Evelyn continued kneeling beside the grave, her fingers trailing lovingly over the freshly turned earth as if she were caressing a living person rather than mourning a corpse. The way she spoke to the burial site with intimate familiarity made his skin crawl, but he knew that showing fear or revulsion would be a fatal mistake. Evelyn was clearly unstable, possibly dangerous, and he was 30 miles from the nearest help with winter storms already making the mountain roads treacherous. His survival depended on convincing her that he wasn't planning to leave, at least until he could figure out how to escape this nightmare without joining the collection of personal belongings scattered around her husband's grave. "Robert was so handsome," Evelyn murmured, her voice carrying the dreamy quality of someone lost in pleasant memories. "Dark hair like yours, Alexander. Strong hands that could fix anything around the farm. He promised we'd be together forever, that nothing would ever separate us." Her pale blue eyes lifted to meet Alexander's gaze with an intensity that made him fight the urge to step backward. Men make promises so easily, don't they? But they don't always understand what forever really means. Alexander cleared his throat carefully, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. He must have been a good man to inspire such devotion. "You've kept his memory alive beautifully, Evelyn." The words felt like poison on his tongue, but he could see the way her expression softened at his apparent understanding of her twisted grief. Playing along with her delusions might be his only chance of staying alive long enough to find an escape route. "Oh, he is a good man," Evelyn corrected with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Death doesn't change who people really are, Alexander. Robert is still protective of me, still watches over our home. Sometimes I can feel him moving through the house at night, checking the doors and windows to make sure I'm safe." She stood gracefully, brushing dirt from her skirts with the same casual ease she might display after gardening. He's been so patient about you being here, but patience has limits." The casual way she spoke about her dead husband's ongoing presence in their lives made Alexander's blood run cold, but he forced himself to nod understandingly while his mind raced through possible explanations for what he'd discovered. The grave was definitely recent, but if Robert had died 2 years ago as Evelyn claimed, who was buried in the fresh earth behind the barn? And why were there so many different personal belongings scattered around the site, clearly belonging to different men from different time periods? As they walked back toward the house, Alexander noticed details about the farm that had seemed merely eccentric before but now appeared sinister in light of his discovery. The vegetable garden was far larger than necessary for 2 people, and the soil was unusually rich and dark as if it had been heavily fertilized with organic matter. The abandoned barn that Evelyn claimed hadn't been used since Robert's death showed clear signs of recent activity, including tool marks that suggested heavy digging and drag marks in the dirt floor that led toward the back door. The house itself felt different now that Alexander understood the true nature of his situation. The perfectly maintained rooms, the lack of dust or neglect that should have accumulated over 2 years of widowhood, the way Evelyn moved through the space with the confidence of someone who was definitely not alone in managing the property. Even Robert's clothes hanging in the wardrobe seemed too fresh, too well-maintained for belongings that should have been gathering dust for years. Dinner that evening was an exercise in controlled terror as Alexander tried to behave normally while his mind processed the horrifying implications of what he'd seen. Evelyn had prepared his favorite meal with her usual meticulous care, setting the table with her finest china and lighting candles that cast dancing shadows across her pale features. She chattered about farm business and winter preparations as if they were any normal couple planning their future together, but Alexander could barely taste the food as his throat constricted with fear. "I've been thinking about spring planting," Evelyn said conversationally as she refilled his coffee cup with steady hands. "Robert always said the backfield would be perfect for expanding our crops, but we never had enough help to clear the stumps and rocks. With you here, we could finally make use of all that good soil." The way she emphasized the words, "good soil," made Alexander's stomach clench with understanding of what might have made the earth so fertile. "That sounds like a wonderful project," Alexander managed to say, though the words felt like gravel in his throat. "I'd be happy to help with whatever you need." The lie came easier than expected, and he saw Evelyn's face brighten with genuine pleasure at his apparent enthusiasm for their shared future. Playing the role of devoted partner might be his only protection against whatever fate had befallen the previous men who'd caught her attention. As the evening wore on, Alexander became increasingly aware of how completely isolated they were on the mountain farm, how easily someone could disappear without a trace in this remote location. The nearest neighbors were miles away across treacherous terrain, and the approaching winter would soon make travel impossible even for someone desperate enough to risk the mountain passes. Evelyn had chosen her location well for privacy, but Alexander was beginning to understand that the privacy served darker purposes than simple solitude. That night, Alexander lay awake in his small cabin listening to the wind howl through the mountain passes while his mind raced with plans for escape that all seemed impossibly dangerous or utterly hopeless. Every sound outside his door made him tense with fear that Evelyn might be approaching with whatever method she'd used to dispose of her previous guests, and every creak of the old wooden structure made him wonder if Robert's ghost was really wandering the property as she claimed, or if she was moving through the darkness checking on his continued presence. The isolation that had once seemed peaceful now felt like a death trap, with winter storms already making the mountain roads impassable for anyone foolish enough to attempt an escape on foot. Morning brought no relief from the terror that had settled into Alexander's bones like a permanent chill, but it did provide opportunities to investigate the property more thoroughly, while Evelyn went about her daily routines with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had no idea her carefully constructed facade had crumbled. Alexander waited until she was busy in the kitchen preparing breakfast, then slipped back to the abandoned barn to examine the grave site more carefully in daylight, hoping to find evidence that might help him understand exactly what kind of danger he was facing. The personal belongings scattered around the burial site told a chilling story when examined more closely in the harsh morning light. The leather wallet was expensive but weathered, suggesting it had belonged to a man of means who'd been dead for some time. The pocket watch was engraved with initials that definitely weren't Robert's, and the clothing items showed signs of having been buried and dug up multiple times, as if Evelyn regularly visited her collection of trophies to reminisce about her victims. Most disturbing of all was a small leather journal tucked beneath a pile of rocks, its pages filled with different handwriting styles and dates that spanned several years. Alexander's hands trembled as he read entries that revealed the horrifying pattern of Evelyn's activities over the past 5 years. Men had been coming to the Walsh farm regularly, drawn by advertisements for work or lodging, and their journal entries documented the same progression that Alexander had experienced. Initial attraction to Evelyn's beauty and apparent vulnerability, growing unease about her possessive behavior and strange habits, and finally desperate plans for escape that had clearly never been successfully executed. The last entry in each man's handwriting was always the same: growing suspicion about Robert's death and discovery of evidence that suggested Evelyn was far more dangerous than she appeared. The most recent entries were in handwriting that Alexander recognized from letters he'd seen around the house, correspondence from a man named Thomas Brennan who'd apparently worked the farm during the previous winter. His final entry was dated only 6 months ago, and the desperate tone of his writing made Alexander's blood run cold. "She knows I found the others. Evelyn has been watching me constantly, and I can see madness in her eyes when she thinks I'm not looking. I have to get away from this place before I end up like Robert and the others. But the snow is too deep to risk the mountain passes. God help me, I think she's planning something terrible." Alexander quickly buried the journal back where he'd found it, his mind reeling with the confirmation that his worst fears about Evelyn were absolutely justified. She wasn't just a lonely widow with eccentric grieving habits. She was a calculating predator who'd been luring men to their deaths for years, probably driven by some twisted need to keep them permanently close rather than risk abandonment. The pattern was clear. She seduced them with her vulnerability and beauty, trapped them with the isolation of winter, and then disposed of them when they tried to leave or discovered her secrets. When he returned to the house for breakfast, Alexander found Evelyn humming cheerfully as she prepared eggs and bacon with the domestic contentment of a woman who'd spent a pleasant evening rather than someone who'd just threatened a man with supernatural retribution for leaving her. Her pale blue eyes were bright with good humor, and she greeted him with a warm kiss that made his skin crawl with revulsion even as he forced himself to respond naturally. Playing the role of devoted partner was becoming more difficult with each interaction, but he knew that showing fear or suspicion would be signing his own death warrant. "You look tired, darling," Evelyn observed as she served his breakfast with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to all aspects of their domestic life. "I hope you slept well in your cabin. Sometimes the mountain winds can be disturbing for people who aren't used to such isolation." The innocent concern in her voice was belied by the calculating way she watched his face for reactions, as if she suspected he'd discovered something that had disturbed his rest. "Just adjusting to the altitude." Alexander lied smoothly, though he could feel sweat breaking out across his forehead despite the cool morning air. "I've never lived this high in the mountains before. It takes some getting used to." He forced himself to eat the perfectly prepared breakfast while his stomach churned with fear and revulsion, knowing that appearing normal was his only protection against whatever fate had befallen the men whose belongings decorated Robert's grave. As the day progressed, Alexander became increasingly aware that Evelyn was watching him with new intensity, her pale eyes following his movements around the property with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential threats. She found excuses to check on his work more frequently than usual, appeared unexpectedly in places where she'd never bothered him before, and asked pointed questions about his future plans that felt more like interrogation than casual conversation. The shift in her behavior suggested that she suspected something had changed in his attitude toward their relationship, though Alexander prayed she hadn't yet figured out exactly what he'd discovered. The most terrifying moment came that afternoon when Evelyn approached him while he was splitting wood for the winter fuel supply, her movements silent and purposeful as she materialized beside him without warning. "Alexander," she said softly, her voice carrying the dangerous calm that he'd learned to associate with her most unstable moods. "You seem distracted today. Is there something troubling you that we should discuss?" The way she emphasized the word discuss made it clear that she wasn't really offering conversation, but rather demanding an explanation for his changed behavior. "Nothing's wrong, Evelyn," Alexander replied carefully, setting down the axe with movements that he hoped appeared casual rather than defensive. "I suppose I'm just feeling the weight of another winter approaching. It makes a man think about the future, about what he wants from life." The response was deliberately vague, designed to give her an opening to reveal more about her own thoughts and plans without committing him to any specific course of action. Evelyn stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used and see the tiny flecks of darker blue in her pale eyes that made them look like winter ice. "The future is exactly what I wanted to talk about," she said with a smile that didn't reach those cold eyes. "Robert and I have been discussing your place here on the farm, and we think it's time for you to make a more permanent commitment to our family." The casual way she included her dead husband in their relationship planning made Alexander's skin crawl, but he forced himself to nod as if her words made perfect sense. "What kind of commitment did you have in mind?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer, and it terrified him more than anything he'd ever faced in his life. Evelyn's smile widened, revealing teeth that were white and perfect and somehow predatory in the afternoon sunlight. "The kind that means you'll never have to worry about leaving us again," she said softly. "The kind that ensures we'll all be together forever, just like Robert promised before he learned to keep his word permanently." Alexander's blood turned to ice at Evelyn's words, but he forced himself to maintain the facade of devoted partner even as his mind raced with desperate escape plans that all seemed impossible given their isolation and the approaching winter storms. The way she spoke about permanent commitment while standing beside the very axe he'd been using to split would made the threat unmistakable, and he realized that his time for subtlety and careful planning had just run out completely. Evelyn suspected something had changed in his feelings toward their relationship, and her twisted logic was already working toward a solution that would ensure he could never abandon her the way she believed Robert and the others had tried to do. "Forever sounds wonderful," Alexander managed to say, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his throat. "But shouldn't we take time to plan properly? A commitment like that deserves careful consideration, don't you think?" He was stalling for time, hoping to delay whatever she had planned long enough to find some way out of the nightmare his life had become. But Evelyn's pale blue eyes were already glittering with the kind of manic excitement that suggested she'd moved beyond rational thought. "Robert said the same thing," Evelyn replied with a laugh that held no warmth or humor, only the brittle sound of someone whose grip on reality had snapped completely. "He wanted to wait, to think things through, to consider all the options. But waiting gives people time to change their minds, to decide they'd rather be somewhere else with someone else. I learned from that mistake, Alexander. I learned that sometimes you have to make the commitment for both people involved." The afternoon sun was already sinking behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the farm that would soon provide cover for whatever Evelyn was planning. Alexander realized with growing horror that she'd chosen this timing deliberately, waiting until darkness would conceal any sounds or evidence of struggle from the unlikely possibility of passing travelers. The isolation that had once seemed peaceful now felt like a carefully constructed trap, with every aspect of the property designed to hide the evidence of what happened to men who tried to leave her. "I should get the evening chores finished before dark," Alexander said, taking a step toward the barn while trying to appear casual rather than desperate. "The animals need tending, and I want to check that loose board on the chicken coop before the next storm hits." He was hoping to reach the tools in the barn, anything that might serve as a weapon or protection against whatever method Evelyn used to ensure her partner's permanent commitment to their relationship. "The animals can wait," Evelyn said firmly, her hand reaching out to grasp his arm with surprising strength for someone who appeared so delicate and fragile. "Robert is getting impatient about your indecision, Alexander. He doesn't like it when I'm kept waiting for answers that should be obvious." Her fingers dug into his flesh hard enough to leave bruises, and he could see something wild and dangerous flickering behind her eyes that suggested rationality had left her completely. Alexander tried to pull free from her grip, but Evelyn's hold tightened with the desperate strength of someone who'd clearly done this before, someone who'd learned exactly how much pressure was needed to control a man who might be having second thoughts about permanent arrangements. "Evelyn, you're hurting me," he said carefully, hoping that appealing to her need to be seen as loving and caring might provide an opening for escape. Pain is temporary, she replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. Robert thought I was hurting him too, at first. They all did. But once they understood that the pain was just part of the process, part of learning to stay forever, they became much more cooperative about the whole arrangement. The casual way she referred to multiple victims confirmed Alexander's worst fears about the scope of her activities over the years. As darkness settled over the mountain valley, Evelyn began leading him toward the barn with movements that suggested she'd rehearsed this particular walk many times before. Alexander's mind raced through desperate options for escape, but every scenario seemed to end with him overpowered and buried behind the barn alongside Robert and the others who discovered Evelyn's true nature too late to save themselves. The approaching winter storms would hide any evidence of struggle, and his disappearance would be easily explained as another drifter who'd moved on to seek work elsewhere. The others fought at first. Evelyn continued conversationally as they walked, her voice carrying the dreamy quality of someone lost in pleasant memories rather than recounting murder. Robert was particularly difficult about accepting his new circumstances, but they all came to understand eventually that fighting only made things more unpleasant for everyone involved. I'm hoping you'll be more reasonable about the transition, Alexander. I've grown quite fond of you. The barn loomed ahead in the gathering darkness, its interior black with shadows that could hide any number of horrors. Alexander could smell that strange, sickly sweet odor that had bothered him since his first day on the farm, and he realized with sick certainty that he was smelling decomposition, the accumulated evidence of Evelyn's years of ensuring that her partners never abandoned her. His steps slowed involuntarily as they approached the building, and he felt Evelyn's grip tighten in response to his hesitation. "Don't make this harder than necessary," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of genuine sadness that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. "I really do care about you, Alexander, which is why I want your transition to be as peaceful as possible." Robert learned to appreciate that consideration eventually, and I think you will too once you adjust to your new situation. In that moment of ultimate desperation, Alexander made the split-second decision that would determine whether he lived or died on this isolated mountain farm. Instead of allowing Evelyn to lead him into the barn where she'd clearly prepared whatever method she used to ensure permanent commitment, he suddenly twisted away from her grip and sprinted toward the main house, hoping to reach the rifle he'd seen hanging above the fireplace mantel. His boots pounded against the frozen ground as he ran, Evelyn's enraged scream echoing behind him like the cry of a hunting predator whose prey had unexpectedly escaped. The front door was unlocked, and Alexander burst through it with enough force to slam the heavy wood against the wall. His hands were shaking as he reached for the rifle, but it was exactly where he'd remembered seeing it, loaded and ready for use against wildlife that might threaten the farm animals. Behind him, he could hear Evelyn's footsteps on the porch, her voice calling his name with the kind of artificial sweetness that barely concealed murderous rage. "Alexander, darling, you're being silly about this," she called through the door, her tone suggesting she was speaking to a child having a tantrum rather than a man fighting for his life. "Come back outside, and let's finish our conversation properly. Robert is getting very upset about your behavior, and you don't want to make him angry when he's already been so patient about sharing me with you." Alexander checked the rifle's action with hands that trembled from adrenaline and terror, grateful for the hunting experience that had taught him to handle firearms under pressure. The weapon was well maintained and fully loaded, giving him at least a chance of defending himself against whatever Evelyn was planning. Through the window, he could see her standing on the porch in the moonlight, her pale dress making her look like a ghost herself as she waited for him to emerge from his temporary sanctuary. "I know what you've been doing, Evelyn," Alexander called through the door, his voice steadier now that he had some means of protection. "I found the journal, the belongings, all the evidence of what happened to Robert and the others. You're not a grieving widow. You're a killer who can't stand to be abandoned." The silence that followed his accusation was more terrifying than any response could have been, suggesting that Evelyn was processing this new information and adjusting her plans accordingly. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of sweetness or sanity, revealing the cold calculation that had allowed her to murder multiple men over the years without being caught. "You shouldn't have gone looking for things that weren't meant to be found," she said with deadly calm. "Robert warned me that you were getting too curious, too suspicious about our arrangements. I should have listened to him sooner. The way she spoke about her dead husband's ongoing involvement in her decisions confirmed that Evelyn's break from reality was complete and permanent. What followed was a night of psychological warfare as Evelyn attempted to convince Alexander to surrender himself voluntarily while he barricaded the doors and windows, determined to survive until morning when he might have a chance of escaping down the mountain trail. She alternated between threats and pleas, promises of gentle treatment, and descriptions of what Robert would do to punish his defiance. Through it all, Alexander maintained his position by the window with the rifle ready, knowing that his life depended on staying alert until he could find a way to escape her isolated kingdom of madness. As dawn broke over the mountain peaks, Alexander saw his opportunity when Evelyn finally exhausted herself and retreated to the barn, probably to prepare some new method of forcing his cooperation. Moving quickly and quietly, he gathered essential supplies and slipped out the back door, making his way toward the trail that led down the mountain to civilization and safety. The journey would be dangerous in winter conditions, but staying on the farm meant certain death at the hands of a woman whose obsession with preventing abandonment had turned her into a calculating predator. The escape down the treacherous mountain trail was a nightmare of ice, snow, and vertigo-inducing drops, but Alexander's determination to survive drove him forward through conditions that would normally have been considered impossible. Behind him, he could hear Evelyn's voice echoing through the valley as she discovered his absence, her screams of rage and betrayal following him down the mountainside like the cries of a demon cheated of its prey. He reached the nearest town 3 days later, frostbitten and exhausted but alive, and immediately reported his experiences to the territorial marshal. The rescue party that returned to the Walsh farm found evidence of multiple murders going back years, but Evelyn herself had vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind only her collection of victims' belongings and the fresh grave that had first warned Alexander of his danger. Some say she died in the mountain storms that followed his escape, but others believe she simply found a new location where she could continue her twisted quest for companions who would never abandon her, no matter what permanent arrangements she had to make to ensure their loyalty. This chilling tale of obsession, isolation, and survival reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful facades hide the darkest truths. If Alexander's harrowing escape from Evelyn's deadly obsession kept you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to our channel and smash that notification bell, because everyone needs to hear these incredible stories of survival against impossible odds. Share this spine-tingling story with someone who loves psychological thrillers, and tell me in the comments which moment had you holding your breath: Alexander's discovery of the grave, Evelyn's terrifying threats, or his desperate midnight escape down the treacherous mountain. Your engagement helps these gripping stories reach others who crave tales of human resilience and survival. What dark story of obsession and escape should we explore next? The mountains hold many secrets, and some of them are more terrifying than others.